Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones that you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Now, most podcasts put their promotion and cup rattling stuff halfway through or even towards the end. But because I'm hoping that you're asleep long before we get there, I need to put this stuff up front. The show is brought to you, as always, by the supporters on Patreon. I'm hearing from people all the time now how valuable they find the show. And those supporters who have the means to help me to keep the show going through funding it and help me reach new audiences are all very much appreciated. So if you're making use of Sleepy Time Tales regularly to help you deal with sleeplessness, and if you have the urge to help to support the show, and most importantly, of course, if you have the means and you can, please take a look at patreon.com/sleepytimetales at the link in the show notes or from the website. You will have the satisfaction of knowing that you're contributing to the rest and lifestyle improvement of thousands of people. And over and above that, there are real rewards from as little as $2 a month. Those rewards include early release of the weekly episode, weekly bonus episodes, and special edits of the main show. And this week I'd like to thank Jennifer D for signing up to support Sleepy Time Tales as a patron. Thanks to you, Jennifer, who also had some very kind words, and to the amazing group of people who you are joining for keeping the show on the road. If a monthly contribution is a bit much for you, there are other ways to support the show. Other than the Patreon, there's the tip jar, the merchandise store, and others. But another huge way you can help the show is simply to spread the word. If there is someone in your life who you think will benefit from listening to Sleepy Time Tales, just let them know. If you recommend the show on social media, make sure to tag me in so that I know and that I can thank you. That's at Sleepy Time Tales on Instagram or Twitter. In fact, those of you who spread the word and share how much Sleepy Time Tales helps you have been very instrumental in the show reaching 150,000 downloads last week. I don't advertise at the moment, and reaching that many people in only 18 months is an amazing achievement, and it's all thanks to you for spreading the word. Last but not least, of course, I would like to shout out the music. The track I use is Un Desire Bakumiku. Their music is available on their free music archive, and I've linked their website in the show notes, as they've got a lot of very cool stuff that they release under different names that I recommend checking out. Thank you for taking the time, and let's get back to the show. So what exactly is Sleepy Time Tales? What is it for? It's a bit of a strange idea, isn't it? A podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to. But lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast that is intended to help those that it can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night with your mind spinning in emotions in turmoil with anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself not quite able to doze back off again at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. I've struggled to sleep ever since I was a baby. I used to give my parents sleepless nights for the longest time, and even once I got old enough not to bother them anymore, sleep really was always a struggle for me. It was only later in life that I discovered the tendency for droning voices, especially but not exclusively male ones, to act almost like a tranquilizer for me. I came to terms with the fact that I had insomnia, and I used to go to bed at night listening to podcasts, and I used to wake up having slept through everything I was actually trying to listen to. I eventually started listening to podcasts specifically to help me sleep, and then after a while I discovered that there's some out there actually intended for that purpose. People that would talk and waffle on about various things to try help the listener to accept sleep as it came. But when I recommended some of the shows I listened to other people, they sometimes just didn't quite get it. Sometimes they didn't like the narrator's voices or the stories that they told or something like that. So I thought to myself, I've got a boring, droning male voice. Let me see if I can do my part to help those that can't be reached by those out there that are doing it already. Now, every episode starts with this long intro. It's there for a very important reason. In fact, I'd argue it's the most important part of the show. The story is fun and all, but if all goes well, you're never going to hear the story because this intro has two major purposes. The first one, obviously, I need to make a case to new listeners, and if you're one of them, welcome. Glad to have you here. Hope to give you a good night's sleep very soon. I need to sort of make the case for the strangeness of the show and why I think it might help you, and how I think it can help you. And for all the listeners, there's something very important as well. Now, they all know exactly how to engage with the show, but this intro goes on for quite a while, and at times it gets a little bit philosophical, besides just being a mechanics of how to listen to a podcast. Because what I'm trying to do here is help you, once you become a familiar older listener, to create a space to prepare yourself in the room around you and your sort of mental space to, that's not what I was trying to look for, but I'm going to stick with it, to prepare you to have a good night's sleep. Because we're trying to build a space together, emotional, mental, and physical, somewhere where you can feel comfortable and relax. Now, as far as I know, there's a couple of different ways to engage with the show. For me, when I listen to my sleep podcasts, I usually need something to actually focus on. I need a story or something that helps me keep my mind focused on something specific, on a point or a storyline, to stop it from spinning out into stress and anxiety. I need to focus just enough not to resist the embrace of a night's sleep when it comes for me. Some people need something a little bit different. They need a background noise, some kind of white noise, whether it's the sound of wind in the trees or the ocean or some boring dude telling you a story. Tonight's story is the beginning of one of H.G. Wells's less well-known apocalyptic tales. The preface starts in the apocalypse, but the story itself is just the story of a young man, unfortunate in love and complaining about it. It ends before anything really fun happens. But whatever the story is, whether it's broken romance or the end of the world, what is important is that you don't force your sleep. You can't really force sleep because that just creates tension. You need to keep a light mental grip on the story and allow sleep to come for you. Now, obviously, I'm hoping that you're asleep before I get to the end of the episode, but it is also important you don't feel pressurized. If this is your first night, this may very well not work for you. It'll probably take a few nights for you to get used to listening to my voice or the idea of it. My accent may be a bit strange to you. I recommend giving it a solid 3-night try. If by the end of the 3rd night it's not working for you, there are other options, and unfortunately I'm not one of them. Insomnia can be strangely specific, and what it takes to get over it can also be very specific. It's also possible that one episode just isn't long enough. Or maybe your problem isn't so much that you can't go to sleep, but that you do wake up in the middle of the night. What I do, because I'm someone who wakes up at 3 a.m. generally, is I queue up I've downloaded a whole bunch of episodes of the podcast that I listen to. I queue them up and then I just let them run. I lie down in the dark and listen to the voice, and then when I wake up at 3 a.m., the stream is still running and I let the voices waft me back to sleep again. Sometimes I even wake up at like 30 minutes or 60 minutes before my alarm goes. I do the same thing then. I carry on listening and it knocks me right back out. And it may seem strange. What is the point of letting yourself fall asleep with only 30 minutes to go? But I've got to tell you that sometimes that can be the best part of my night. There's something about just allowing deep relaxation right before the alarm that is deeply, deeply satisfying. I've even had people thank me for that suggestion because it's improved their lives even, because turns out that's actually not uncommon. So if you're someone who wakes up before the alarm, just try to get back to sleep again and you find your days going much smoother. But whether you're a late sleeper or an early waker or someone who wakes up in the middle of the night, it is very important that when you're listening to the show, you try to relax. If you're new to the show and prone to late nights lying staring at the ceiling, this may seem strange to you. It probably is a bit strange, to be honest. So I recommend you give it a chance. And that's the basic idea. You relax and you lie in the dark, and while you do that, I tell you a tale. So relax, my dear listener, my nighttime friend who has elected to lie in the dark, listening to my voice. You will always be safe with me, because I'm here to help you relax, to improve your life in a small way, or maybe not so small. Because these days people don't sleep very well, and it makes life harder. So I'm here to do my small part to help you in a big way, to help you to face tomorrow and the day after, well rested and better able to cope and process. I believe very strongly in the benefits of kindness. I want to be kind to you. I want to share kindness with you. And I need you to be kind to yourself. If you beat yourself up or rebuke yourself over not sleeping, there's nothing that I can do to help you. Don't get tense if you just can't get yourself over the edge of sleep, even with me here in your ears trying to help. Frustration is one of the great enemies of a good night's sleep. If you're an insomniac, I'm pretty sure you're at some point in your life laying awake in bed, near tears or in tears, just at the frustration of not being able to let go and sleep. And the intention of this podcast is to help short-circuit that frustration, to distract the feeling we get when we blame ourselves for not being able to let go and drift into the dark. So take a breath. Forgive the fact you can't sleep and let my voice wash over you. Take another breath. Imagine the warm darkness rising up, inviting you to sleep and to a better life starting tomorrow. And if you can't let go, forgive yourself and we'll try again tomorrow. If you've had a life of insomnia, sleep is something like an enemy. But it's not your enemy. It's a natural process we've been pulled away from by stress and life and progress that shines bright lights in our eyes at all hours. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course, you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. In the Days of the Comet by H.G. Wells. Prologue. The Man Who Wrote in the Tower. I saw a grey-haired man, a figure of hale age, sitting at a desk and writing. He seemed to be in a room in a tower, very high, so that through the tall window on his left one perceived only distances, a remote horizon of sea, a headland, and that vague haze and glitter in the sunset that many miles away marks a city. All the appointments of this room were orderly and beautiful, and in some subtle quality, in this small difference and that, new to me and strange. They were in no fashion I could name, and the simple costume the man wore suggested neither period nor country. It might, I thought, be the happy future or utopia, or the land of simple dreams, an errant mote of memory. Henry James's phrase and story of the great good place twinkled across my mind and passed and left no light. The man I saw wrote with a thing like a fountain pen. a modern touch that prohibited any historical retrospection, and as he finished each sheet writing in an easy flowing hand, he added it to a growing pile upon a graceful little table under the window. His last done sheets lay loose, partly covering others that were clipped together into fascicles. Clearly he was unaware of my presence, and I stood waiting until his pen should come to a pause. Old as he certainly was, he wrote with a steady hand. I discovered that a concave speculum hung slantingly high over his head. A movement in this caught my attention sharply, and I looked up to see, distorted and made fantastic, but bright and beautifully colored, the magnified, reflected, evasive rendering of a palace, of a terrace, of the vista of a great roadway with many people. People exaggerated, impossible looking because of the curvature of the mirror, going to and fro. I turned my head quickly that I might see more clearly through the window behind me, but it was too high for me to survey this nearer scene directly, and after a momentary pause I came back to that distorting mirror again. But now the writer was leaning back in his chair. He put down his pen and sighed the half-resentful sigh. Ah, you, work you, how you gratify and tire me, of a man who has been writing to his satisfaction. What is this place? I asked, and who are you? He looked around with a quick movement of surprise. What is this place? I repeated, and where am I? He regarded me steadfastly for a moment under his wrinkled brows, and then his expression softened to a smile. He pointed to a chair beside the table. I am writing, he said. About this? About the change. I sat down. It was a very comfortable chair and well placed under the light. If you would like to read, he said. I indicated the manuscript. This explains, I asked. That explains, he answered. He drew a fresh sheet of paper towards him as he looked at me. I glanced from him about his apartment and back to the little table. A fascicle marked very distinctly 1 caught my attention, and I took it up. I smiled in his friendly eyes. Very well, said I, suddenly at my ease, and he nodded and went on writing. And in a mood between confidence and curiosity, I began to read. This is the story that happy, active-looking old man in that pleasant place had written. Book the First, The Comet. Chapter the First, Dust in the Shadows. Section 1. I have set myself to write the story of the great change, so far as it affected my own life and the lives of 1 or 2 people closely connected with me, primarily to please myself. Long ago in my crude, unhappy youth, I conceived the desire of writing a book. To scribble secretly and dream of authorship was one of my chief alleviations, and I read with a sympathetic envy every scrap I could get about the world of literature and the lives of literary people. It is something, even amidst this present happiness, to find leisure and opportunity to take up and partially realize these old and hopeless dreams. But that alone, in a world where so much of vivid and increasing interest presents itself to be done, even by an old man, would not, I think, suffice to set me at this desk. I find some such recapitulation of my past as this will involve as becoming necessary to my own secure mental continuity. The passage of years brings a man at last to retrospection. At 72, one's youth is far more important than it was at 40. And I am out of touch with my youth. The old life seems so cut off from the new, so alien and so unreasonable, that at times I find it bordering upon the incredible. The data have gone, the buildings and places. I stopped dead the other afternoon in my walk across the moor, where once the dismal outskirts of Swathinglea straggled towards Leet, and asked, was it here indeed that I crouched among the weeds and refuse and broken crockery, and loaded my revolver ready for murder? Did ever such a thing happen in my life? Was such a mood and thought and intention ever possible to me? Rather, has not some queer nightmare spirit out of dreamland slipped a pseudo-memory into the records of my vanished life? There must be many alive still who have had the same perplexities. And I think too that those who are now growing up to take our places in the great enterprise of mankind will need many such narratives of mine for even the most partial conception of the old world of shadows that came before our day. It chances too that my case is fairly typical of the change. I was caught midway in a gust of passion, and a curious accident put me for a time in the very nucleus of the new order. My memory takes me back across the interval of 50 years to a little ill-lit room with a sash window open to a starry sky, and instantly there returns to me the characteristic smell of that room, the penetrating odor of an ill-trimmed lamp burning cheap paraffin. Lighting by electricity had then been perfected for 15 years, but still the larger portion of the world used these lamps. All this first scene will go, in my mind at least, to that olfactory accompaniment. That was the evening smell of the room. By day it had a more subtle aroma, a closeness, a peculiar sort of faint pungency that I associate, I know not why, with dust. Let me describe this room to you in detail. It was perhaps 8 feet by 7 in area, and rather higher than either of these dimensions. The ceiling was of plaster, cracked and bulging in places, grey with the soot of the lamp, and in one place discoloured by a system of yellow and olive green stains, caused by the percolation of damp from above. The walls were covered with dun-coloured paper upon which had been printed in oblique reiteration a crimson shape, something of the nature of a curly ostrich feather or an acanthus flower, that had in its less faded moments a sort of dingy gaiety. There were several big plaster-rimmed wounds in this, caused by Parload's ineffectual attempts to get nails into the wall, whereby there might hang pictures. One nail had hit between 2 bricks and got home, and from this depended, sustained a little insecurely by frayed and knotted blind cord, Parload's hanging bookshelves. Planks painted over with a treacly blue enamel, and further decorated by a fringe of pink American cloth, insecurely fixed by tacks. Below this was a little table that had behaved with mulish vindictiveness to any knee that was thrust beneath it suddenly. It was covered with a cloth whose pattern of red and black had been rendered less monotonous by the accidents of Parload's versatile ink bottle, and on it, leitmotif of the whole, stood and stank the lamp. The lamp, you must understand, was of some whitish translucent substance that was neither china nor glass. It had a shade of the same substance, a shade that did not protect the eyes of a reader in any measure, and it seemed admirably adapted to bring into pitiless prominence the fact that after the lamp's trimming, dust and paraffin had been smeared over its exterior with a reckless generosity. The uneven floorboards of this apartment were covered with scratched enamel of chocolate hue, on which a small island of frayed carpet dimly blossomed in the dust and shadows. There was a very small grate, made of cast iron in one piece and painted buff, and a still smaller misfit of a cast iron fender that confessed the grey stone of the hearth. No fire was laid. Only a few scraps of torn paper and the bowl of a broken corncob pipe were visible behind the bars. And in the corner and rather thrust away was an angular japanned coal box with a damaged hinge. It was the custom in those days to warm every room separately from a separate fireplace, more prolific of dirt than heat, and the rickety sash window, the small chimney, and the loose-fitting door were expected to organize the ventilation of the room among themselves without any further direction. Parload's truckle bed hid its grey sheets beneath an old patchwork counterpane on one side of the room, and veiled his boxes and such-like oddments, and invading the two corners of the window were an old whatnot and the wash-hand stand on which were distributed the simple appliances of his toilet. This wash-hand stand had been made of deal by someone with an excess of ternary appliances in a hurry, who had tried to distract attention from the rough economies of his workmanship by an arresting augmentation of blobs and bulbs upon the joints and legs. Apparently, the piece had then been placed in the hands of some person of infinite leisure, equipped with a pot of ochreous paint, varnish, and a set of flexible combs. The person had first painted the article, then, I fancy, smeared it with varnish, and then sat down to work with the combs, to streak and comb the varnish into a weird imitation of the grain of some nightmare timber. The wash-hand stand so made had evidently had a prolonged career of violent use, had been chipped, kicked, splintered, punched, stained, scorched, hammered, desiccated, damped, and defiled. Had met indeed with almost every possible adventure except a conflagration or a scrubbing, until at last it had come to this high refuge of Parload's attic to sustain the simple requirements of Parload's personal cleanliness. There were, in chief, a basin and a jug of water, and a slop pail of tin, and further, a piece of yellow soap in a tray, a toothbrush, a rat-tailed shaving brush, one huckaback towel, and one or two other minor articles. In those days, only very prosperous people had more than such an equipage, and it is to be remarked that every drop of water Parload used had to be carried by an unfortunate servant girl, the slavey as Parload called her, up from the basement to the top of the house and subsequently down again. Already we begin to forget how modern an invention is personal cleanliness. It is a fact that Parload had never stripped for a swim in his life, never had a simultaneous bath all over his body since his childhood. Not 1 in 50 of us did in the days of which I am telling you. A chest, also singularly grained and streaked, of 2 large and small drawers, held Parload's reserve of garments, and pegs on the door carried his 2 hats, and completed this inventory of a bed-sitting room, as I knew it before the change. But I had forgotten. There was also a chair with a squab that apologized inadequately for the defects of its cane seat. I forgot that for the moment because I was sitting on the chair on the occasion that best begins the story. I have described Parload's room with such peculiarity because it will help you understand the key in which my earlier chapters are written. But you must not imagine that the singular equipment or the smell of the lamp engaged my attention at that time to the slightest degree. I took all this grimy unpleasantness as if it were the most natural and proper setting for existence imaginable. It was the world as I knew it. My mind was entirely occupied then by graver and intenser matters, and it is only now, in the distant retrospect, that I see these details of environment as being remarkable, as significant, as indeed obviously the outward visible manifestations of the old world disorder in our hearts. Section 2. Parload stood at the open window, opera glass in hand, and sought and found and was uncertain about and lost again the new comet. I thought the comet no more than a nuisance because I wanted to talk of other matters. But Parload was full of it. My head was hot. I was feverish with interlacing annoyances and bitterness. I wanted to open my heart to him. At least I wanted to relieve my heart by some romantic rendering of my troubles, and I gave but little heed to the things he told me. It was the first time I had heard of this new speck among the countless specks of heaven, and I did not care if I never heard of that thing again. We were two youths, much of an age together. Parload was 22 and 8 months older than I. He was, I think his proper definition was engrossing clerk, to little solicitor in Overcastle, while I was third in the office staff of Rawdon's Potbank in Clayton. We had first met in the Parliament of the Young Men's Christian Association of Swathinglea. We had found we attended simultaneous classes in Overcastle, he in science and I in shorthand, and had started a practice of walking home together. And so our friendship came into being. Swathinglea, Clayton, and Overcastle were contiguous towns, I should mention, in the great industrial area of the Midlands. We had shared each other's secret of religious doubt. We had confided to one another a common interest in socialism. He had come twice to supper at my mother's on a Sunday night, and I was free of his apartment. He was then a tall, flaxen-haired, gawky youth, with a disproportionate development of neck and wrist, and capable of vast enthusiasm. He gave 2 evenings a week to the evening classes of the organized science school in Overcastle. Physiography was his favorite subject, and through this insidious opening of his mind, the wonder of outer space had come to take possession of his soul. He had commandeered an old opera glass from his uncle, who farmed at Leet over the moors. He had bought a cheap paper planisphere and Whittaker's almanac, and for a time day and moonlight were mere blank interruptions to the one satisfactory reality in his life: stargazing. It was the deeps that had seized him, the immensities and the mysterious possibilities that might float unlit in that unplumbed abyss. With infinite labor and the help of a very precise article in The Heavens, a little monthly magazine that catered for those who were under this obsession, he had at last got his opera glass upon the new visitor to our system from outer space. He gazed in a sort of rapture upon that quivering little smudge of light among the shining pinpoints, and gazed. My troubles had to wait for him. Wonderful, he sighed. And then, as though his first emphasis did not satisfy him, wonderful. He turned to me. Wouldn't you like to see? I had to look, and then I had to listen. How that this scarce visible intruder was presently to be, one of the largest comets this world has ever seen. How that its course must bring it within at most so many score of millions of miles from the Earth, a mere step. Parload seemed to think that, how the spectroscope was already sounding its chemical secrets, perplexed by the unprecedented band in the green, how it was even now being photographed in the very act of unwinding, in an unusual direction, a sunward tail, which presently it wound up again. And all the while, in a sort of undertow, I was thinking of Nettie Stewart and the letter she had just written me, and then of old Rawdon's detestable faces I had seen it that afternoon. Now our planned answers to Nettie, and now belatedly repartees to my employer, and then again, Nettie was blazing all across the background of my thoughts. Nettie Stewart was daughter of the head gardener of the rich Mr. Verrill's widow, and she and I had kissed and become sweethearts before we were 18 years old. My mother and hers were second cousins and old schoolfellows, and though my mother had been widowed untimely by a train accident, and had been reduced to letting lodgings, she was the Clayton curate's landlady, a position esteemed much lower than that of Mrs. Stewart. A kindly custom of occasional visits to the gardener's cottage at Checkshill Towers still kept the friends in touch. Commonly I went with her, and I remember it was the dusk of one bright evening in July, one of those long golden evenings that do not so much give way to night as admits at last upon courtesy the moon and a choice retinue of stars, that Nettie and I, at the pond of goldfish where the yew-bordered walks converged, made our shy beginner's vow. I remember still, something will always stir in me at that memory, the tremulous emotion of that adventure. Nettie was dressed in white. Her hair went off in waves of soft darkness from above her dark, shining eyes. There was a little necklace of pearls about her sweetly mottled neck, and a little coin of gold that nestled in her throat. I kissed her half-reluctant lips, and for 3 years of my life thereafter, nay, I almost think for all the rest of her life and mine, I could have died for her sake. You must understand, and every year it becomes increasingly difficult to understand, how entirely different the world was then from what it is now. It was a dark world. It was full of preventable disorder, preventable diseases, and preventable pain, of harshness and stupid, unpremeditated cruelties. But yet, it may be even by virtue of the general darkness, there were moments of a rare and evanescent beauty that seemed no longer possible in my experience. The great change has come forevermore. Happiness and beauty are our atmosphere. There is peace on earth and goodwill to all men. None would dare to dream of returning to the sorrows of the former time. And yet that misery was pierced ever and again, and its grey curtain was stabbed through and through by joys of an intensity, by perceptions of a keenness that it seems to me are now altogether gone out of life. Is it the change, I wonder, that has robbed life of its extremes? Or is it perhaps only this, that youth has left me? Even the strength of middle years leaves me now, and taken its despairs and raptures, leaving me judgment, perhaps sympathy, memories. I cannot tell. One would need to be young now and to have been young then as well to decide that impossible problem. Perhaps a cool observer, even in the old days, would have found little beauty in our grouping. I have our 2 photographs at hand in this bureau as I write, and they show me a gawky youth in ill-fitting ready-made clothing, and Nettie. Indeed, Nettie is badly dressed, and her attitude is more than a little stiff. But I can see her through the picture, and her living brightness and something of that mystery of charm she had for me comes back again to my mind. Her face has triumphed over the photographer, or I would long ago have cast this picture away. The reality of beauty yields itself to no words. I wish that I had the sister art and could draw in my margin something that escapes description. There was a sort of gravity in her eyes. There was something, a matter of the minutest difference about her upper lip, so that her mouth closed sweetly and broke very sweetly to a smile. That grave, sweet smile. After we had kissed and decided not to tell our parents for a while of the irrevocable choice we had made, the time came for us to part, shyly and before others, and I and my mother went off back across the moonlit park, the bracken thickets rustling with startled deer, to the railway station at Checkshill, and so on to our dingy basement in Clayton. And I saw no more of Nettie, except that I saw her in my thoughts for nearly a year. But at our next meeting it was decided that we must correspond, and this we did with much elaboration of secrecy, for Nettie would have no one at home, not even her only sister, know of her attachment. So I had to send my precious documents sealed and undercover by way of a confidential schoolfellow of hers who lived near London. I could write that address down now, though house and street and suburb have gone beyond any man's tracing. Our correspondence began our estrangement, because for the first time we came into more than sensuous contact, and our minds sought expression. Now you must understand the world of thought in those days was in the strangest condition. It was choked with obsolete, inadequate formulae. It was tortuous to a maze-like degree with secondary contrivances and adaptations, suppressions and conventions and subterfuges. Base immediacies fouled truth on every man's lips. I was brought up by my mother in a quaint, old-fashioned, narrow faith in certain religious formulae, certain rules of conduct, certain conceptions of social and political order that had no more relevance to the realities and needs of everyday contemporary life than if they were clean linen that had been put away with lavender in a drawer. Indeed, her religion did actually smell of lavender. On Sunday, she put away all the things of reality, the garments and even the furnishings of every day, hid her hands that were gnarled and sometimes chapped with scrubbing in black, carefully mended gloves, assumed her old black silk dress and bonnet, and took me, unnaturally clean and sweet also, to church. There we sang and bowed and heard sonorous prayers and joined in sonorous responses, and rose with a congregational sigh, refreshed and relieved when the doxology, with its opening, "Now to God the Father, God the Son," bowed out the tame, brief sermon. There was a hell in that religion of my mother's, a red-haired hell of curly flames that had once been very terrible. There was a devil who was also ex officio the British King's enemy, and much denunciation of the wicked lusts of the flesh. We were expected to believe that most of our poor, unhappy world was to atone for its muddle and trouble here by suffering exquisite torments forever after, world without end. Amen. But indeed, those curly flames looked rather jolly. The whole thing had been mellowed and faded into a gentle unreality long before my time. If it had been much terror even in my childhood, I have forgotten it. It was not so terrible as the giant who was killed by the beanstalk. And I see it now as a setting for my poor old mother's worn and grimy face, and almost lovingly as a part of her. And Mr. Gabbitas, our plump little lodger, strangely transformed in his vestments and lifting his voice manfully to the quality of these Elizabethan prayers, seemed, I think, to give her a special and peculiar interest with God. She radiated her own tremulous gentleness upon him, and redeemed him from all the implications of vindictive theologians. She was, in truth, had I but perceived it, the effectual answer to all she would have taught me. So I see it now, but there is something harsh in the earnest intensity of youth, and having at first taken all these things quite seriously, the fiery hell and God's vindictiveness at any neglect, as though they were as much a matter of fact as Bladden's ironworks and Rawdon's potbank, presently, with an equal seriousness, flung them out of my mind again. Mr. Gabbitas, you see, did sometimes, as the phrase went, take notice of me. He had induced me to go on reading after I left school, and with the best intentions in the world and to anticipate the poison of the times, he had lent me Birble's Skepticism Answered, and drawn my attention to the library of the Institute in Clayton. The excellent Burble was a great shock to me. It seemed clear from his answers to the skeptic that the case for doctrinal orthodoxy and all that faded, and by no means awful hereafter, which I had hitherto accepted as I accepted the sun, was an extremely poor one. And to hammer home that idea in the first book I got from the Institute happened to be an American edition of the collected works of Shelley. His gassy prose as well as his atmospheric verse. I was soon ripe for blatant unbelief, and at the Young Men's Christian Association I presently made the acquaintance of Parload, who told me, under promise of the most sinister secrecy, that he was a socialist out and out. He lent me several copies of a periodical with the claimant title of The Clarion, which was just taking up a crusade against the accepted religion. The adolescent years of any fairly intelligent youth lie open, and will always lie healthily open, to the contagion of philosophical doubts, of scorns and new ideas, and I will confess I had the fever of that phase badly. Doubt, I say, but it was not so much doubt, which is a complex thing, as a startled, emphatic denial. Have I believed this? and I was also, you must remember, just beginning love letters to Nettie. We live now in these days, when the great change has been in most things accomplished, in a time when everyone is being educated to a sort of intellectual gentleness. A gentleness that abates nothing from our vigor, and it is hard to understand the startled and struggling manner in which my generation of common young men did its thinking. To think at all about certain questions was an act of rebellion that sent one oscillating between the furtive and the defiant. People begin to find Shelley, for all his melody, noisy and in condition now because his anarchs have vanished. Yet there was a time when novel thought had to go to that tune of breaking glass. It becomes a little difficult to imagine this yeasty state of mind, the disposition to shout and say "ya" at constituted authority. To sustain a persistent note of provocation such as we raw youngsters displayed. I began to read with avidity such writing as Carlyle, Browning, and Heine have left for the perplexity of posterity, and not only to read and admire, but to imitate. My letters to Nettie, after one or two gently intended displays of perfervid tenderness, broke out towards theology, sociology, and the cosmos in turgid and startling expressions. No doubt they puzzled her extremely. I retained the keenest sympathy and something inexplicably near to envy for my own departed youth. But I should find it difficult to maintain my case against anyone who would condemn me altogether as having been a very silly, posturing, emotional hobbyhoy indeed, and quite like my faded photograph. And when I try to recall what exactly must have been the quality and tenor of my more sustained efforts to write memorably to my sweetheart, I confess I shiver. Yet I wish they were not all destroyed. Her letters to me were simple enough, written in a roundish, unformed hand and badly phrased. Her first 2 or 3 showed a sharp pleasure in the use of the word dear, and I remember being first puzzled and then, when I understood, delighted, because she had written Willie as Thor under my name. As Thor, I gathered, meant darling. But when the evidences of our fermentations began, her answers were less happy. I will not weary you with the story of how we quarrelled in our silly youthful way, and how I went the next Sunday, all uninvited, to Checkshill and made it worse, and how afterward I wrote a letter that she thought was lovely and mended the matter. Nor will I tell you of all our subsequent fluctuations of misunderstanding. Always I was the offender and the final penitent, until this last trouble that was now beginning. And in between we had some tender near moments, and I loved her very greatly. There was this misfortune in the business, that in the darkness and alone I thought with great intensity of her eyes, of her touch, of her sweet and delightful presence. But when I sat down to write, I thought of Shelley and Burns and myself and other such irrelevant matters. When one is in love in this fermenting way, it is harder to make love than it is when one does not love at all. And as for Nettie, she loved, no, not me, but those general mysteries. It was not my voice should rouse her dreams to passion. So our letters continued to jar. Then suddenly she wrote me one doubting whether she could ever care for anyone who was a socialist and did not believe in church. And then hard upon it came another note with unexpected novelties of phrasing. She thought we were not suited to each other. We differed so in tastes and ideas. She had long thought of releasing me from our engagement. In fact, though I really did not apprehend it fully at first shock, I was dismissed. Her letter had reached me when I came home after old Rawdon's none too civil refusal to raise my wages. On this particular evening of which I write, therefore, I was in a state of feverish adjustment to 2 new and amazing, 2 nearly overwhelming facts: that I was neither indispensable to Nettie nor at Rawdon's, and to talk of comets. Where did I stand? I had grown so accustomed to think of Nettie as inseparably mine. The whole tradition of true love pointed me to that. that for her to face about with these precise small phrases towards abandonment after we had kissed and whispered and come so close in the little adventurous familiarities of the young shocked me profoundly. I. And Rawdon didn't find me indispensable either. I felt I was suddenly repudiated by the universe and threatened with effacement, that in some positive and emphatic way I must at once assert myself. There was no balm in the religion I had learnt, nor in the irreligion I had adopted for wounded self-love. Should I fling up Rawdon's place at once and then in some extraordinary swift manner make the fortune of Frobish's adjacent and closely competitive pot bank? The first part of that program, at any rate, would be easy of accomplishment. To go to Rawdon and say, "You'll hear from me again." But for the rest, Frobisher might fail me. That, however, was a secondary issue. The predominant affair was with Nettie. I found my mind thick shot with flying fragments of rhetoric that might be of service in the letter I would write her. Scorn, irony, tenderness, what was it to be? "Brother," said Parload suddenly. "What?" said I. "They're firing up Bladden's ironworks, and the smoke comes right across my bit of sky." Interruption came just as I was ripe to discharge my thoughts upon him. "Parload," said I, "very likely I shall have to leave all this. Old Rawdon won't give me a rise in my wages, and having asked, I don't think I can stand going out on the old terms anymore. See, so I may have to clear out of Clayton for good and all. And I think I'm going to leave it there. If you've enjoyed what you've heard of the story so far, you can find In the Days of the Comet up on Project Gutenberg at the link that you will find in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Un Désert by Kumiku. Check out more of their work on their website, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.